Picture this, the roaring 20s. Jazz spills onto the streets. Like bathtub gin, hemlines are rising faster than eyebrows, and one haircut defines it all. Not just any haircut, mind you, we're talking the bob. Sleek, black, sharp as shattered glass, framing a face that could launch 1,000 ships. Or maybe just sink a few lucrative studio contracts with a single, dismissive glance. Meet Louise Brooks. Yeah, that Louise Brooks, the undisputed face of the flapper generation. A silent film siren whose stark image practically screamed a modern woman with a capital M and W. But here's the kicker. Behind that revolutionary haircut, and those come hither but -on single quotes T-you-dare-touch-me eyes was a brain even sharper, and a will even more formidable. She was dazzling, undeniably dangerous to the status quo, and let's be honest, probably way too smart for a Hollywood system that preferred its stars beautiful, bankable, and above all, obedient. Think challenging Nietzschean philosophy tucked inside a sleek Chanel dress. So what happens when a star doesn't just refuse to play the game, but flips the whole damn board over? What happens when she values her artistic integrity, her freedom, more than the glittering cage of fame? Well, folks, you get one of Hollywood's most fascinating, frustrating, and plot twist, ultimately triumphant vanishing acts. She burned brighter than a magnesium flare, seemed to burn out just as quickly, and then did something absolutely nobody in Tinseltown expected. She didn't just fade away. She regrouped, reloaded, and prepared to write her own ending. This isn't just a story about a killer haircut or another Hollywood flameout. Though, trust me, we'll get to the juicy bits. At its core, this is about a lifelong, unapologetic, downright stubborn search for freedom. Freedom from the dusty plains of small-town Kansas. Freedom from the iron grip of studio control. Freedom from the suffocating expectations placed on women. And finally, the hard-won freedom to tell her own damn story, in her own biting words. Buckle up, buttercups, because Louise Brooks' real life is wilder, smarter, and way more compelling than any movie she ever starred in. Ready to unveil the real Louise Brooks, beyond the bob and the myth? Let's dive in. Our story kicks off not under the palm trees and Klieg lights of California, but way out in Cherryvale, Kansas. Mark your calendars, November 14th, 1906. Yeah, think less Hollywood glamour, much more. Well, Kansas, a small town where ambitions, you might imagine, were probably geared more towards surviving the Dust Bowl years or maybe running the local general store than dreaming of becoming an iconoclastic silent film star. It was a place firmly planted in the American heartland, with all the perceived virtues and, for someone like Louise, the stifling limitations that implied. Her dad, Leonard Porter Brooks, was a respectable and, by all accounts, pretty busy lawyer. His world likely revolved around legal briefs, court dates, and the kind of local politics that keep small towns running. He seems to have been a somewhat distant figure in Louise's early life, perhaps more pragmatic and grounded compared to the artistic inclinations bubbling elsewhere in the household. He provided stability, a solid middle-class foundation, but perhaps not the imaginative fuel his daughter would eventually crave. But then there was her mom, Myra Rude Brooks. Now she was the spark plug, the artistic conduit in the family. A talented pianist, Myra wasn't just playing scales. She harbored her own frustrated artistic ambitions. She saw something special, maybe even incandescent, in young Louise, perhaps a reflection of her own unfulfilled dreams, maybe a glint of future stardom, and let's be real, maybe a few potential dollar signs too. It was Myra who actively encouraged Louise's early flair for performance, for dance, for anything that set her apart from the Cherryvale norm. You can almost picture Myra practicing Chopin in the parlor, her fingers flying across the keys, while the tiny Louise is already perfecting that intense. Don single quotes T-mess- with -me stare in the hallway mirror, absorbing the music and the maternal ambition simultaneously. Myra once reflected on her approach to raising her children, stating frankly, "If I had had children and suppressed them, I would have been censured. Since I have had children and liberated them, I have been censured. That gives you a pretty good idea of the atmosphere she fostered. One encouraging expression, even if it ruffled local feathers. Life in the Brooks household wasn't exactly the lap of luxury. Louise was one of 4 children, so things were likely bustling, occasionally chaotic, and definitely not dripping with extravagance. They weren't poor, but they weren't the Rockefellers either. Comforts were modest. Yet, thanks largely to Myra, the house was filled with something perhaps more valuable than riches, books and music. Think less Little House on the Prairie, with its focus purely on survival and chores, and more a version where Lavra Ingalls Wilder might have been encouraged to read Schopenhauer alongside her sewing sampler. Fueled by intellectual curiosity and a healthy dose of what Brooks herself would later call her perpetual discontent, this environment, valuing arts and letters even in provincial Kansas, was crucial. It planted seeds of intellectual curiosity that would blossom spectacularly later on. Even as a kid, forgetting the iconic Bob for a moment, Louise possessed a certain something. Childhood photos show a bright, inquisitive child. Maybe not the conventionally cherubic or pretty ideal of the Victorian era that was just fading, but those eyes. Even back then, they seemed to hold secrets, a depth of observation, and maybe a hint of defiance. They looked like they were already analyzing the world around them and weren't entirely impressed. You get the feeling she was probably already silently judging everyone's fashion choices and finding them wanting. There's a famous, almost foreshadowing anecdote where Myra, ever the stage mom in spirit, sent baby Louise's photo to a local newspaper contest sponsored by a baby food company, highlighting her supposedly perfect physical form. Even then, her appearance was being put forward for public judgment, a theme that would echo, albeit in vastly different ways, throughout her life. It's a slightly jarring, slightly amusing glimpse into the forces already swirling around this Kansas kid destined for anything but a quiet life. But let's face it, Cherryvale, Kansas, despite the books and music at home, wasn't going to hold a spirit like Louise Brooks for long. She needed an escape route, a way to channel that burgeoning energy and intellect. She found it, early and passionately, in dance. This wasn't just about taking a few ballet lessons at the local hall. This girl had an innate physicality, a natural grace combined with that fierce intensity. Dance became her first language of expression, her initial taste of commanding attention, of moving beyond the ordinary, of, well, freedom. It was a way to physically embody the emotions and ideas that perhaps words couldn't yet capture, a way to carve out her own space in the world, one ply and pirouette at a time. She later reflected quite simply on its foundational importance, saying, "There is no calculating the influence of the dance on my life. It wasn't merely a hobby. It was her liberation, and when she wasn't dancing, she was reading, voraciously." Louise wasn't flipping through dime novels or girls' adventure stories. She was diving headfirst into serious literature and philosophy, reportedly tackling thinkers like Schopenhauer at an age when most kids are still navigating the complexities of playground politics. This wasn't your average teenager dreaming of movie stars or football heroes. She was constructing an intellectual fortress around herself, brick by challenging brick. Can you imagine? Picture her casually quoting German philosophers while her peers were maybe trading baseball cards or gossiping about the latest town scandal. Talk about potentially awkward playdates. This deep dive into complex thought shaped her critical perspective, gave her analytical tools, and likely contributed to her later disdain for the perceived superficiality of Hollywood. It set her apart, fueling both her confidence and perhaps her isolation. She wasn't just performing. She was thinking, questioning, analyzing, a dangerous combination in a world, especially the future world of Hollywood, that often preferred its beauties less brainy. However, her childhood wasn't solely defined by artistic pursuits and intellectual growth. A dark shadow fell across these formative years, an event that undoubtedly left deep, invisible scars. We have to mention, carefully and sensitively, the documented instance of childhood sexual abuse she suffered at the hands of a neighbor when she was just 9 years old. Brooks herself spoke about it later in life, recounting how when she told her mother, Myra essentially blamed her, suggesting her own allure had provoked the man. This traumatic experience, compounded by her mother's shocking response, is impossible to overlook when trying to understand the woman Louise became. It likely contributed significantly to her fears, almost obsessive need for independence and control in her later life. Her profound mistrust of others, particularly men in positions of power, her complex and often challenging views on sex and intimacy, and her lifelong quest to never, ever be powerless or victimized again. It's a heartbreaking element, a violation that tragically fueled her already simmering determination to control her own destiny, to escape any situation where she might be vulnerable. That relentless search for freedom wasn't just an artistic or intellectual pursuit, it was deeply rooted in this early trauma. Even amidst this darkness and her burgeoning seriousness, glimpses of the future rebel were already apparent. There are stories, perhaps slightly embellished over time but fitting the pattern, of her early stubborn streak. One anecdote suggests she refused point-blank to participate in a school play or pageant she deemed utterly silly and beneath her. While other children might have gone along reluctantly, Louise, even then, seemed incapable of feigning enthusiasm or compromising her own judgment. If Louise didn't believe in something, good luck trying to make her do it. It wasn't just about being difficult. It was an early manifestation of that core integrity, that refusal to participate in anything she considered false or unworthy. You see, the seeds were sown right there in Kansas dirt. The intense desire to escape the confines of small-town life, the need to express herself physically and intellectually, the deep-seated determination to control her own narrative, and the trauma that added a layer of fierce protective armor. That uncompromising search for freedom, in all its complex facets, didn't just appear when she hit Hollywood. It started way back home. So let's paint the picture, growing up in Cherryvale, Kansas in the early years of the 20th century. It's pre-World War I, pre-Roaring '20s, a time when America was shifting, but hadn't quite exploded into the modern era yet. For a budding, bookish, fiercely independent, and artistically inclined young woman like Louise Brooks, let's just say the opportunities for self-expression and boundary-pushing were, severely limited. Can you imagine the internal friction? Reading about worldly philosophies and European art while looking out at dusty Kansas streets? Honestly, who wouldn't feel an overwhelming urge to run screaming towards the nearest metropolis? The sheer gravitational pull of the wider world must have been immense. The cultural context is key here. This was the era just before the seismic shifts of the Jazz Age truly took hold nationwide. Women were starting to agitate for the vote. Hemlines were still relatively modest, though change was whispering on the wind, and the idea of a flapper was still coalescing. Yet, the undercurrents of change were there, in magazines, in news filtering in from the big cities, in the very books Louise was devouring. She was breathing in the nascent atmosphere of modernity, even from the relative isolation of Kansas. This wasn't just about wanting to leave home. It was about wanting to join a world that seemed to promise more excitement, more intellectual stimulation, and crucially, more freedom than Cherryvale could ever offer. She wasn't just running from something, she was running towards a future she sensed was being born elsewhere. Imagine the potential culture shock, the whiplash she must have anticipated, or perhaps craved. Moving from a place where everyone likely knew everyone else's business, where social conventions were strong and tightly knit, to the intoxicating anonymity and exhilarating chaos of a major city like New York or, eventually, the dream factory of Hollywood. It's the classic American narrative, small-town values versus big city ambitions. The innocent confronting the sophisticated world. Except Louise was never really playing the part of the wide-eyed innocent. She was armed with Schopenhauer and a dancer's discipline, already cynical and observant beyond her years. She wasn't looking to be molded by the big city. She was looking for a stage big enough to accommodate her already formed, complex personality. She wasn't interested in following the standard Hollywood script of rags to riches or ingenue makes good. She wanted to write her own. Her undeniable talent, particularly in dance, honed by her own dedication and relentlessly promoted by her ambitious mother Myra, became her passport. It was the tangible skill that could punch her ticket out of Kansas. Dance wasn't just expression, it was currency. It opened the first door, the one leading away from the predictable future Cherryvale seemed to offer. The destination wasn't entirely clear yet, perhaps, but the direction was unmistakable: outward, upward, away. Next stop, the world stage. Or at least, the slightly less dusty, infinitely more complex stages waiting for her outside the borders of her home state. Kansas had laid the groundwork, the intellect, the ambition, the trauma, the stubborn independence. Now, it was time to see what Louise Brooks would do with it all in the wider world. The escape was imminent. The escape hatch finally sprang open, not with a direct flight to Hollywood, but via the world of modern dance. Louise, barely 15, landed a coveted spot with the prestigious Tinseltown Dance Company around 1922. This was the big leagues of American dance at the time, founded and run by the legendary pioneers Ruth St. Denis and Ted Shawn. Think high art, rigorous discipline, exotic costumes inspired by Eastern cultures, and a serious, almost spiritual approach to movement. It was a world away from Kansas, immersed in creativity and demanding technical perfection. You'd think this would be the perfect fit for an artistic soul like Louise, right? Well, not quite. Tinseltown demanded discipline, yes, but also a certain conformity to the vision of its founders. And Louise, bless her fiercely independent heart, wasn't exactly built for conformity. While she absorbed the technique and undoubtedly benefited from the training, her sharp tongue, rebellious attitude, and perhaps a certain intellectual impatience with the company's more mystical leanings didn't exactly endear her to the management, particularly Ted Shawn. Accounts suggest she was challenging, questioned authority, and generally stirred the pot. After a couple of years, she was dismissed, reportedly for her perceived superior attitude, or more bluntly, for being disruptive. It was an early, clear sign. Louise Brooks was not going to blindly follow anyone's rules, not even in the supposedly liberated world of modern dance. As she might have quipped, even artistic communes have their dogmas, a fact Louise perhaps found both predictable and irritating. This dismissal, however, wasn't an end, it was merely a redirection. From the high art aspirations of Tinseltown, Louise pivoted, landing squarely on the glittering stages of Broadway. In 1925, she joined the chorus line of the Ziegfeld Follies, the absolute pinnacle of American musical revue entertainment. Florence Ziegfeld Jr.'s spectacular productions were famous for glorifying the American girl, which meant dazzling sets, opulent costumes dripping with feathers and sequins, catchy tunes, and of course, rows upon rows of stunningly beautiful women. It was pure spectacle, high glamour, and maybe, for someone like Louise, not a whole lot of deep intellectual stimulation. Imagine transitioning from Tinseltown's serious choreography to strutting across the stage in elaborate headpieces, essentially as living decoration. She was undeniably gorgeous, a standout even among Ziegfeld's beauties, catching eyes with her unique look and vibrant energy. But one gets the distinct impression she was probably already bored, observing the whole glittering machine with a detached, analytical eye. She later described the Follies rather dismissively, remarking something to the effect that showgirls were intellectuals compared to the movie people she'd later encounter, hinting at her low opinion of the intellectual level in both spheres. Even surrounded by glamour, her critical mind was always working. Naturally, Hollywood scouts, constantly trawling Broadway for fresh faces, weren't blind. They saw her, that face, that electric presence, that indefinable it factor that separates a pretty girl from a potential star. Walter Wanger, then an executive at Paramount Pictures, spotted her in the Follies. Some accounts say she was actually fired from the Follies too, possibly for reasons similar to her Tinseltown departure, or maybe she just left when Hollywood called. Details vary, but the pattern holds. Paramount Pictures offered her a 5-year contract in 1925. Now, it's important to understand the studio contract system back then. It wasn't like being a freelance actor today. stars were essentially property. The studio dictated their roles, controlled their image, managed their publicity, and often meddled extensively in their personal lives. For someone already bristling against the constraints of Denishan and the Follies, signing onto the Hollywood studio system was like walking into a gilded cage. Freedom wasn't exactly part of the deal, and then came the haircut. Sometime around 1924 or 1925, either just before or during her early Follies days, Louise adopted the hairstyle that would become her eternal trademark, that severe, sleek, black, helmet-like bob with the straight, heavy bangs cutting clear across her forehead. It wasn't just a fashionable choice, it was a radical statement in an era transitioning away from Gibson girl updos. It was chic, sharp, slightly androgynous, and utterly modern. It framed her face perfectly, emphasizing those expressive, intelligent eyes. It wasn't soft or traditionally feminine. It had an edge, a hint of danger. It screamed, "I am not your grandmother's Gibson girl." That haircut became instantly iconic, a visual shorthand for the modern, independent woman of the jazz age. Suddenly, you can bet barbershops and beauty parlors were flooded with women demanding the Louise Brooks bob. Blame Louise or thank her for defining a look that still resonates today. Paramount quickly put her to work, casting her in a string of silent films. Her first credited role was in The Street of Forgotten Men in 1925, a small part, but she quickly moved up. An early significant role came in The American Venus in 1926. The irony, she played a beauty contest winner who travels across the country, sponsored by a cosmetics company. The film itself was a flimsy excuse to showcase attractive women, but it put Louise on the map. Then came Love M and Leave M in 1926, directed by Frank Tuttle, where she really got to shine as a quintessential flapper, mischievous, energetic, breaking hearts, and looking fabulous while doing it. These early roles capitalized on her look and her youthful energy. She was playing the girl, the jazz baby, the embodiment of the roaring 20s spirit. They were decent parts, establishing her screen persona, but perhaps not stretching her much beyond looking stunning and projecting a captivating, slightly naughty vivacity. She was learning the ropes of film acting, adapting her stage presence for the camera, but the roles themselves were often conventional flapper fare. You got the feeling she was capable of much, much more. The question was, would Hollywood ever give her the chance? Her early career was a whirlwind: dance, Broadway, Hollywood, the iconic haircut, all by the age of 20. She was on the fast track, but knowing Louise, she was probably already eyeing the emergency brake. Life at Paramount chugged along. Louise made several more films, often playing variations on the flapper theme, sometimes with notable directors like Howard Hawks in A Girl in Every Port, a 1928 Fox film made while she was on loan, and William Wellman in Beggars of Life that same year. Beggars of Life, in particular, hinted at her dramatic potential. Playing a young woman on the run after killing her abusive stepfather, she disguised herself as a boy and rode the rails with hobos, including Wallace Beery. It was grittier than her usual fare, and she delivered a performance of quiet intensity, showcasing a vulnerability beneath the tough exterior. Critics noticed her talent, praising her naturalism and expressive face. She was becoming a popular star, her image synonymous with modern youth. But Hollywood, even with occasional interesting roles, was starting to feel restrictive. The studio system, the formulaic plots, the emphasis on glamour over substance, it likely chafed against her intellectual curiosity and artistic integrity. She craved something more challenging, something deeper. And then, opportunity knocked from an unexpected direction: Europe, specifically Germany. Eder G.W. Pabst. Georg Wilhelm Pabst was one of the leading directors of the German New Objectivity movement in cinema. He was known for his stark realism, his psychological insight, and his often dark, socially critical themes. He wasn't interested in Hollywood gloss. He wanted truth, grit, and complex characters. Pabst had seen Louise Brooks, possibly in A Girl in Every Port or Beggars of Life, and saw something extraordinary. He saw beyond the pretty face, beyond the flapper image, to the intelligence, the ambiguity, and the simmering fire beneath the surface. He decided she was the only actress who could play the lead in his next ambitious project. Paramount, initially, refused to let her go. They were about to transition her to sound films and had plans for her. But Louise, sensing a unique artistic opportunity, perhaps the opportunity she'd been waiting for, defied the studio. Accounts differ on the exact sequence, but essentially, she walked out on Paramount and sailed for Berlin. It was a huge gamble, a slap in the face to the powerful studio heads. But it led her to the role and the film that would define her legacy forever. This is it, the big one. Pandora's Box Die Butch der Pandora, released in 1929. Forget everything else if you must, but remember Lulu. Brooks is Lulu, the character adapted from Frank Wedekind's controversial plays. Lulu is, well, how do you even describe Lulu? She's a dancer, a kept woman, possibly a prostitute, an utterly captivating creature of impulse and innocent sensuality, whose very presence seems to sow chaos and destruction wherever she goes. She's not deliberately malevolent, but she's amoral, living entirely in the moment, a force of nature in silk stockings. Men and women like the Countess Geschwitz fall desperately in love with her, project their desires onto her, and are ultimately destroyed by her, or by their obsession with her. Brooks's performance is nothing short of mesmerizing. She doesn't act Lulu, she embodies her. Her naturalism, her subtle expressions, the way she uses those incredible eyes to convey innocence, desire, confusion, and ultimately, a kind of blank acceptance of fate. It's completely modern, completely magnetic. She's a black hole of desire pulling everyone, characters and audience alike, into her orbit. Pabst surrounded her with brilliant German actors, but Brooks holds the center with an effortless, almost eerie power. The film itself was shocking for its time. Its frank depiction of sexuality, including lesbianism albeit subtly, its critique of bourgeois morality, its bleak, tragic trajectory culminating in Lulu's encounter with Jack the Ripper. This was miles away from the frothy comedies or melodramas Hollywood was churning out. Was it shocking? Oh yeah. Unforgettable? Absolutely. Pabst's direction is masterful, creating a claustrophobic, decadent atmosphere. But it's Brooks's Lulu that burns itself into your memory. The film initially bombed in the United States, where critics and audiences found it too dark, too decadent, too foreign. They wanted their flappers fun and harmless, not complex and destructive. Hollywood effectively pretended it didn't exist. But in Europe, particularly in France, intellectuals and cinephiles recognized its brilliance. It achieved cult status almost immediately, cementing Louise Brooks not just as a Hollywood starlet, but as a true icon of modernist cinema, a muse for a visionary European director. America wanted Mary Pickford's Sunshine. Pabst and Brooks gave them Lulu's shadow, awkward, proving that Pandora's Box wasn't just a fluke. Brooks and Pabst immediately collaborated again on Diary of a Lost Girl, Tagebuch einer Verlorenen, also released in 1929. Based on a controversial novel, it told the story of Thymian, a young woman from a respectable family who is seduced, becomes pregnant, is sent to a brutal reformatory, escapes, ends up in a brothel, and navigates the hypocrisies and exploitations of society. Again, Pabst tackled dark themes: sexual exploitation, social injustice, the precariousness of female existence. And again, Brooks delivered a nuanced, heartbreaking performance. Thymian is a different character than Lulu, more victimized, perhaps more resilient in her own way. But Brooks brought the same astonishing naturalism and emotional depth to the role. It was another powerful, challenging film, further solidifying her reputation in Europe as a serious dramatic actress capable of plumbing uncomfortable depths. These two Pabst films represent the absolute zenith of her acting career, showcasing a talent that Hollywood had barely begun to tap. Her third major European film, made in France, was pre-debut Miss Europe, released in 1930. Directed by Augusto Giannina, it was significant as her first sound film. Sort of. While shot with sound capabilities, Brooks's voice, deemed unsuitable or perhaps just inconveniently American for a French film, was ultimately dubbed by another actress. Talk about irony. She finally gets to talk on screen, and it's not even her voice. The film itself is visually stunning, a glossy melodrama about a beauty queen whose fame leads to tragedy. Brooks is luminous, captivating as always, and the film has its merits, but it perhaps lacks the raw power and depth of her past collaborations. It marked the end of her brief but brilliant European chapter. The transition to sound was proving tricky for everyone in the industry, and for Brooks, having burned her bridges with Paramount and now having her voice dubbed in Europe, the path forward looked increasingly uncertain. But those three films, Pandora's Box, Diary of a Lost Girl, and Pre-Debut, remain her towering achievements, securing her place in film history regardless of what came next. Her working relationship with Pabst, in particular, seems to have been a meeting of minds, intense, mutually respectful, creatively demanding. He didn't coddle her like Hollywood might have. He challenged her intellect and her instincts. As Brooks herself noted, Pabst treated talented actors like adults capable of understanding direction, remarking, "He never told me what to do, only what to think," and she rose to that challenge magnificently, leaving behind a legacy etched in celluloid. So, our heroine conquers Europe, stars into bona fide masterpieces of German cinema, becomes an icon for European cinephiles. Surely Hollywood would roll out the red carpet upon her return, right? Welcome her back with open arms, maybe even a grudging respect for her artistic daring. Wrong. So wrong. Hollywood, particularly Paramount, was more like that jealous ex who sees you thriving without them and thinks, "Oh, you're doing great. How inconvenient, and how dare you?" The first major hurdle was the sound barrier, but it wasn't just technical. It was political. Paramount did want her back initially. They needed stars for their new talkies, but they wanted her back on their terms. This meant sound tests, retakes, and likely a hefty dose of humble pie. Louise, fresh off the exhilarating creative freedom she experienced working with a genius like G.W. Pabst in Berlin, where her talent was valued and her intelligence respected, looked at Hollywood's demands and essentially said, "Now, more specifically." The infamous incident involved the Canary murder case from 1929. She had filmed her scenes as a silent picture before leaving for Europe. When the studio decided to convert it into a talkie, they recalled her to dub her own lines. Brooks, embroiled in her contract dispute and perhaps feeling insulted by the clunky early sound technology and dialogue, flat out refused to return from Europe just for retakes. Big mistake. Professionally speaking, huge. Paramount, furious, hired actress Margaret Livingston to dub Brooks's lines, intentionally making her voice sound awkward and grating, arguably as a petty act of revenge. This refusal cemented her reputation as being difficult and uncooperative. That difficult label, once applied in 1920s, 30s Hollywood, was practically career cyanide. You have to remember the studio system's power. They controlled production, distribution, exhibition, and the stars' careers. Independence wasn't valued, obedience was. Refusing the studio's demands, questioning their judgment, prioritizing artistic integrity over contractual obligations, this wasn't seen as principled, it was seen as insubordination. The public might have adored the rebellious image of the flapper on screen, but the guys signing the checks, they wanted compliance, not commentary. Louise Brooks, with her sharp mind, sharp tongue, and utter refusal to play the Hollywood game, became the poster child for the ungrateful star who didn't know her place. Imagine the studio head's face, maybe Jesse L. Lasky or Adolf Zucker at Paramount, when word came back that their star, the one they'd invested in, was refusing point blank to come back and loop dialogue. Steam probably billowed from his ears. You could practically hear the screech of brakes on her Hollywood career trajectory right then and there. Her defiance didn't stop with the Canary murder case. She famously turned down the lead role in Public Enemy in 1931 opposite James Cagney. The part of Gwen Allen eventually went to Jean Harlow and helped make her a superstar. Why did Brooks refuse? Accounts vary. Some say she simply didn't like the script or the part. Others suggest she was already feeling disillusioned with Hollywood and perhaps didn't want to commit to another potentially restrictive contract. Was it artistic principle, stubborn pride? A streak of self-sabotage? Probably. As with most things Louise, a potent cocktail of all three. She seemed constitutionally incapable of doing something she didn't believe in, even if it meant torpedoing her own career prospects. She later reflected on this period with characteristic bluntness. I had decided that I could not serve two masters, God and Hollywood. So I bade Hollywood goodbye, a typically dramatic Brooksian statement, perhaps, but it captures her sentiment of choosing integrity over industry demands, the inevitable result of burning bridges with Paramount and gaining a reputation for being difficult was a swift and brutal decline. While perhaps not an official, organized conspiracy, she was effectively blacklisted. Major studios stopped calling. The offers that did come in were for increasingly marginal roles in lower-budget pictures, often for independent studios or poverty row outfits. She appeared in a few forgettable B-movies and even a Western, Empty Saddles, in 1936, opposite Buck Jones. Can you picture Lulu on a horse? Her naturalistic acting style, which had been so revolutionary and effective in her silent films and Pabst collaborations, perhaps didn't translate as well in the often broader, more theatrical style favored in early talkies, or maybe directors simply didn't know how to utilize her unique, subtle presence. She wouldn't just act in the conventional sense, she would be. She conveyed complex thoughts and emotions with a glance, a subtle shift in posture. Studios, wanting more obvious emoting, might have yelled, more tears, more anger. And Louise would likely just give them that look, the one that said, I understand the situation perfectly, and your direction is idiotic. That kind of quiet intensity could be confusing, even intimidating, to directors used to more pliable performers. The trajectory was clear, and it was heading down, fast. The bright flame that had illuminated European cinema was flickering dangerously low in the harsh winds of Hollywood rejection. Okay, let's pause the downward spiral for a moment and really talk about legacy, about what made Louise Brooks so special, even beyond the drama and the career challenges. What did she actually bring to the table? Quite a lot, actually. First, and most obviously, the bob. We've mentioned it, but it bears repeating. That sharp black helmet of hair wasn't just a haircut, it was a cultural earthquake. It became the definitive look of the 1920s modern woman, chic, liberated, independent, maybe a little dangerous, definitely not conforming to outdated Victorian ideals of soft, flowing femininity. It was architectural, bold, and perfectly framed her striking features, particularly those incredibly expressive eyes. It's one of the few hairstyles in history that instantly evokes an entire era and a specific attitude. Coco Chanel might have liberated women's bodies with her designs, but Louise Brooks, with that haircut, liberated their heads, visually at least. Its influence is undeniable and pops up again and again in fashion even today. She didn't invent the bob, but she perfected it, owned it, made it iconic. But reducing Louise Brooks to just a haircut is like reducing Muhammad Ali to just a pair of boxing gloves. Her acting style was arguably even more revolutionary, especially for American cinema at the time. Remember, silent film acting often relied on broader gestures and more exaggerated facial expressions to convey emotion without dialogue. Even into the early talkies, a certain theatricality persisted. Louise, however, possessed an astonishing naturalism. She understood the power of stillness, the nuance of a glance, the emotion conveyed in the subtle tightening of a lip. Her performances felt internally driven, psychologically true, decades before method acting became a buzzword. While some contemporaries were emoting wildly for the back row or the primitive new microphones, Brooks conveyed complex inner states with an almost minimalist precision. Think of Lulu in Pandora's box, the way her eyes can shift from childlike innocence to knowing awareness in a split second, often without a dramatic change in expression. Her performances weren't like flashy fireworks. They were more like deep ocean currents, powerful and unsettling beneath a seemingly calm surface. Film historian Lord Eisner famously captured this essence by saying Brooks needed no directorial guidance. She simply was. That's high praise, suggesting an innate, intuitive understanding of screen presence that was truly ahead of its time. She certainly embodied the flapper archetype on screen in her early Hollywood films, the energy, the style, the playful rebellion. But she was always more than just the archetype. Even in those lighter roles, she infused her characters with an undercurrent of intelligence, a hint of melancholy, or a flicker of defiance that made them resonate beyond the typical jazz baby stereotype. She wasn't just decorative, there was always a mind working behind those eyes. She made the flapper seem less like a caricature and more like a complex, real person navigating a rapidly changing world. And this brings us back to our central theme, that relentless search for freedom, her clashes with the studio system, her refusal to compromise her artistic instincts, her willingness to walk away from fame and fortune. These weren't just temper tantrums or bouts of diva behavior, though maybe sometimes they were tinged with that too. Fundamentally, they stemmed from her deep-seated need for autonomy, her refusal to be controlled or pigeonholed. She fought for the freedom to choose her roles, to work with directors she respected, to maintain her integrity in an industry built on compromise and conformity. That struggle, that stubborn insistence on being herself, became part of her legend. It cost her dearly in the short term, leading to her Hollywood exile, but it also imbued her image with a lasting power, the artist who wouldn't sell out. She made being difficult, in the sense of having principles, look incredibly chic, even if it proved disastrously unprofitable at the time. Her iconic work, particularly Pandora's Box, remains the ultimate showcase for everything that made her unique. The unforgettable look, the revolutionary acting style, the portrayal of a complex, morally ambiguous character, and the European sensibility she embraced when Hollywood failed to challenge her. It's pure, undiluted Louise Brooks, a performance preserved in cinematic amber, still potent and unsettling today. Critics and historians consistently point to Lulu as one of the most compelling and enigmatic performances in silent film history. Kevin Brownlow, the preeminent silent film historian, aptly called her incandescent, noting her rare ability to project intelligence even in silence. Her naturalism and subtle power undoubtedly influenced later generations of actors who sought a more realistic, less theatrical approach to screen performance, even if they didn't explicitly cite her. Her image, that combination of sharp modernity, intelligence, and vulnerability, continues to inspire fashion designers, artists, and filmmakers who find in her a timeless symbol of cool, nonconformist beauty. She wasn't just a star, she was a statement. And that statement continues to echo. So, we've seen Louise the star, the rebel, the artist. But what about Louise the woman, off-screen? Finding lasting love and stable relationships? Let's just say her track record in that department was, well, distinctly Hollywood, and maybe even more tumultuous. If her career path was a roller coaster, her personal life was often right there beside it, hitting the same dizzying highs and stomach-churning lows. 2 official marriages, both ending faster than a silent film reel could unspool, tell part of the story. Her first husband was the director Eddie Sutherland. They married in July 1926, when Louise was just 19 and already a rising Paramount star. Sutherland, who directed her in It's the Old Army Game alongside W.C. Fields, was older and established. It seemed like a typical Hollywood pairing, young starlet, successful director. But this was Louise Brooks. Typical wasn't really in her vocabulary. The pressures of Hollywood, her burgeoning fame, his career demands, and likely her own restless, independent spirit didn't make for a smooth ride. By all accounts, it was a volatile union. She was notoriously unfaithful, something she spoke about quite openly later. They divorced just 2 years later, in June 1928. No picket fences and happily ever afters here. There was also a brief, intense relationship, sometimes described as an unofficial marriage or common law arrangement, with George Preston Marshall around 1931-32. Marshall was a millionaire businessman, the future owner of the Washington Redskins football team, a powerful, wealthy figure. This relationship occurred during her Hollywood decline, perhaps offering a semblance of security. But it too fizzled out quickly amidst reports of clashes and Brooks's general incompatibility with the life of a conventional wealthy man's companion. She wasn't cut out to be merely decorative arm candy, no matter how rich the arm. Her second official marriage was to Chicago millionaire and socialite Deering Davis in 1933. This happened after her film career had largely evaporated. On the surface, it might have looked like a chance for stability, a retreat from the wreckage of her Hollywood ambitions into a world of comfortable wealth. They lived on his farm. She tried to play the part of the society wife for a time. But again, the cage, even a gilded one, was still a cage. The marriage lasted longer than her first, until 1938, but it was reportedly just as unhappy, marked by her restlessness and likely her drinking. She simply wasn't built for domesticity or the constraints of traditional marriage. As she famously quipped, reflecting her deep cynicism about romance, love is a publicity stunt, and making love, well, that's the carrying out of the stunt. It's a harsh assessment, maybe partly defensive, but it reveals a profound skepticism about conventional relationships. Beyond her marriages, Louise was famously unsentimental and remarkably open for her time, and maybe even for ours, about her sexuality and her numerous affairs. She lived life strictly on her own terms, even in the bedroom, and didn't seem to care much for societal judgment. She was linked with some of the most famous and powerful men of her day. Her brief but memorable encounter with Charlie Chaplin during a visit to New York while he was filming The Gold Rush is well documented, mostly by her own sharp recollections. She also had a significant, longer-term affair with William S. Paley, the formidable founder and mogul of CBS radio and television. Paley was reportedly captivated by her beauty and intelligence, supporting her financially for years, even long after their romance ended. There were others too, a string of lovers drawn to her unique magnetism. She didn't play coy. She approached sex and relationships with a kind of frank, analytical detachment that could be both liberating and, perhaps, emotionally distancing. Friendships, too, were often intense and sometimes fraught with complications. She formed a close bond with Peppy Lederer, the niece of Marion Davies, William Randolph Hearst's longtime companion and sister of screenwriter Charles Lederer. Peppy was part of the fast-living, often drug and alcohol-fueled Hollywood social set. Their friendship seems to have been genuine, but also tangled up in the drama and insecurities that often swirled beneath the surface glamour of Tinseltown. These weren't always easy, supportive bonds. They reflected the often destructive pressures of the environment. Contemporaries described Louise herself in contradictory terms. Some found her brilliant, witty, and captivating. Others found her sharp tongue cruel, her independence off-putting, her judgments harsh. Playwright Arthur Lawrence, who knew her later in life, offered a typical assessment. She was impossible, difficult, but fascinating. That seems to capture the general consensus. She was a fascinating dinner guest you might hesitate to invite back too often, unless you enjoyed intellectual sparring and potentially having your own character dissected with surgical precision. This liberated image, the woman who defied convention in her career and her personal life, stands in fascinating contrast to the potential loneliness or inherent difficulty she seemed to have in forming truly lasting, stable emotional bonds. The very freedom she craved, that fierce independence she guarded so jealously, sometimes looked suspiciously like isolation. Was her cynicism a defense mechanism? Was her refusal to compromise in relationships as self-defeating as it sometimes appeared in her career? It's complex. She sought freedom from constraints, but finding freedom with others seemed perpetually elusive. Her relationships, like her career, were marked by brilliance, intensity, and ultimately, a kind of uncompromising solitude. After the Hollywood flameout in the early 1930s, and the eventual disintegration of her second marriage in 1938, things got tough for Louise Brooks, really tough. The period from the late 1930s through the 1940s and into the early 1950s is often referred to as her wilderness years. She vanished completely from the public eye, a forgotten relic of the silent era. The woman who had commanded international attention, worked with cinematic geniuses, and defined an era's look was now adrift, struggling just to get by. The fall from grace was precipitous and brutal, especially financially. Star salaries and glamorous premieres gave way to trying to make rent. She returned to Wichita, Kansas for a time, attempting to open a dance studio, but that didn't pan out. She eventually ended up back in New York City, far from the spotlight, taking on whatever work she could find. The most famous, and perhaps most poignant, example of this period was her job working as a sales clerk in the lingerie department of a Saks Fifth Avenue auxiliary shop on Madison Avenue around 1946. Can you just imagine? The woman whose sultry image graced screens worldwide, the legendary Lulu, now quietly selling stockings and girdles to wealthy shoppers, likely unrecognized, just trying to earn a meager living. It's the ultimate, almost cruel, Hollywood plot twist played out in the harsh reality of obscurity. There were other odd jobs, periods of relying on the generosity of former lovers like Paley, a constant struggle for financial stability. It was a stark, humbling contrast to the life she had once known. Compounding these external difficulties were internal battles. Louise wrestled significantly with alcoholism, particularly during these difficult wilderness years and later in life. It's a struggle many artists and former stars have faced when confronted with obscurity, disappointment, or the ghosts of their past. Like many who burned incredibly bright and incredibly fast, she grappled with demons, and alcohol likely became a dangerous solace, a way to numb the pain, the boredom, or the bitterness. Acknowledging this isn't about judgment. It's about understanding the human cost of her tumultuous life and career. The fierce independence could only shield so much. The bottle offered a temporary, destructive escape. Beyond alcohol, there was a clear tendency towards reclusiveness and isolation, especially as she aged. Even during her fame, she possessed a certain detachment, an observer's critical eye. In obscurity, this intensified. She withdrew from the world, living in small apartments, her circle of contact shrinking. Periods of depression undoubtedly colored these years. The sharp wit, the fierce intelligence, the defiant spirit, these qualities were always there, but they sometimes masked a deep vulnerability, perhaps born from that early trauma and reinforced by later betrayals and disappointments. Fighting the world, as she had done with studios and societal expectations, is exhausting. But fighting yourself, grappling with your own complex nature, regrets, and addictions, that's a whole other level of drama, played out far from any camera in the quiet desperation of anonymity. Naturally, time and hardship also changed her appearance. The iconic, sleek black bob eventually surrendered to gray. The smooth, luminous face that captivated Pabst became lined with the map of a difficult life. Photos from her later years show a woman who had clearly weathered storms. Yet, even in those images, the fundamental essence of Louise Brooks remains unmistakable. The sharp intelligence still burns in her eyes. There's still that direct, uncompromising gaze, that refusal to be anything less than completely herself. The fire hadn't gone out. It had perhaps just banked low, glowing with the embers of experience, wisdom, and maybe a lingering trace of defiance. She might have traded sequins for more comfortable shoes, but the core integrity, the unique spirit, was still visibly present. Throughout all this turmoil, one constant remained: her love of reading. Books had been her companions since childhood in Kansas, her intellectual fortress against the world. During the long years of obscurity, they became her primary solace, her connection to ideas, to history, to worlds beyond her own constrained circumstances. Reading wasn't just a pastime, it was essential sustenance for her active mind. And eventually, This lifelong passion for words would provide an unexpected path back from the wilderness, not as an actress, but as something else entirely. Books, her constant friends, would ultimately become her weapon, her tool for reclaiming her own narrative. The reader was preparing to become the writer, just when it seemed Louise Brooks was destined to fade into history as a footnote, a forgotten flapper with a great haircut. Something remarkable happened. France again. In the early 1950s, Henry Langlois, the legendary co-founder and curator of the Cinémathèque Française in Paris, began championing her work. Langlois was a cinematic archaeologist dedicated to preserving film history and recognizing neglected artists. He screened her films, particularly the Pabst masterpieces Pandora's Box and Diary of a Lost Girl, hailing her as a major cinematic talent, an actress of unique power and modernity. Suddenly, across the Atlantic, this forgotten actress was being rediscovered, celebrated by a new generation of filmmakers, the future French New Wave directors among them, and serious critics. Talk about a comeback nobody saw coming. Articles began appearing, retrospectives were organized. Louise Brooks, living quietly and obscurely in New York, started hearing whispers of her own resurrection as a screen icon. This European revival caught the attention of James Card, the influential film curator at the George Eastman House, now the George Eastman Museum, in Rochester, New York, one of the world's leading film archives. Card was also a great admirer of Brooks's work and managed to track her down in New York City around 1956. He was struck not only by her surviving beauty, but by her incredible memory, sharp intellect, and incisive opinions about film and her own career. Recognizing the unique historical perspective she possessed, Card did something brilliant. He persuaded her to move to Rochester, offering her access to the museum's vast film collection and archives, and crucially, encouraging her to write down her memoirs and reflections. He essentially gave her a haven, a purpose, and the tools to finally tell her own story. Trading the anonymity of New York City, or the faded glamour of the coasts, for the relative quiet of upstate New York might seem like an odd move, but Rochester provided her with a stable base, intellectual companionship through Card and the archive, and the focused environment she needed to embark on a new chapter. And right she did, starting in the late 1950s and continuing through the 60s and 70s. Louise Brooks reinvented herself as a writer. And let me tell you, she wasn't churning out fluffy Hollywood gossip or sentimental recollections. Oh no. She picked up her pen like a scalpel and proceeded to dissect her own life, the film industry, her former colleagues, and the art of cinema itself with astonishing insight, brutal honesty, and a rapier wit that could draw blood. Her essays began appearing in prestigious international film journals like Britain's Sight and Sound and the American journal Film Culture. Titles like Pabst and Lulu, Marion Davies' Niece, a complex portrait of Pepe Lederer, and Why I Will Never Write My Memoirs, ironically part of the collection that became her memoir, showcased her distinctive voice. She wasn't just recounting events, she was analyzing them, offering sharp, often scathing critiques of Hollywood hypocrisy, the studio system's destructive power, and the nature of stardom. Instead of waiting for a casting call that would never come, she seized control of the narrative. And boy, did she have scores to settle, truths to tell, and myths to dismantle. Her writing style was as unique as her screen presence, elegant, precise, intelligent, fearless, and often wickedly funny. She could eviscerate a former colleague or a Hollywood mogul with a perfectly turned phrase. For instance, her famous takedown of the actor's studio and method acting, particularly targeting Marlon Brando and Elia Kazan, was legendary for its perceptive critique and utter lack of reverence. She dismissed the method's focus on tortured introspection as mere navel-gazing. Reading her essays is like watching a master fencer at work, all grace, precision, and deadly accuracy. She didn't pull punches, whether writing about Chaplin's peculiarities, Humphrey Bogart's early career struggles she acted with him, or her own mistakes and motivations. Anecdotes abound of her sharp observations. She once wrote, regarding the studio head's perception of actors, myths grow like weeds and are as difficult to eradicate. That kind of cynical, clear-eyed assessment was pure Brooks. Her daily life in Rochester settled into a pattern. She lived reclusively, mostly alone, in a small apartment, surrounded by her beloved books. She spent hours reading, writing meticulously researched essays, watching films provided by the Eastman House, and corresponding with film historians, critics, and the occasional curious journalist or admirer. James Card remained a vital friend and supporter. It was a quiet life, a stark contrast to the frenzy of her youth, but it seemed to provide the structure and intellectual engagement she needed. This final act, this transformation into a respected writer and film historian, was perhaps the ultimate, most profound expression of her lifelong search for freedom. She was no longer dependent on studios, directors, or public opinion. She wasn't being interpreted, she was the interpreter. She controlled the narrative, literally, by writing it herself, on her own terms, with unflinching honesty and enduring style. She had found her final, most powerful voice, not on the screen, but on the page. So, after all the drama, the highs, the lows, the vanishing act, and the remarkable return as a writer, what is the lasting legacy of Louise Brooks? Let's be clear, it's huge, multifaceted, and continues to resonate decades after her peak fame. First and foremost, she remains the incarnation of the jazz age flapper. When people picture that era, it's often her image, the bob, the beads, the defiant yet vulnerable gaze, that comes to mind. She captured not just the look, but the spirit of the modern woman emerging in the 1920s, independent, stylish, perhaps a bit reckless, challenging conventions. She's a permanent fixture in the visual and cultural iconography of that decade. Beyond the image, she stands as a pioneering figure in naturalistic screen acting. As we discussed, her subtle, intelligent, internally driven style was revolutionary, especially compared to the more theatrical norms of the time. She demonstrated that profound emotion and psychological complexity could be conveyed with minimal fuss, relying on presence and nuance. She paved the way for more modern approaches to film performance, proving that quiet intensity could be just as, if not more, powerful than overt emoting. She is, undeniably, a cult film heroine, thanks almost entirely to her electrifying performance as Lulu in Pandora's Box. That film, and her portrayal, transcended its initial reception to become a cornerstone of silent film studies and a touchstone for depictions of enigmatic, complex female characters. Lulu remains one of cinema's most debated and compelling figures, and Brooks's performance is inseparable from the film's enduring power. Her fashion influence is undeniable and ongoing. That bob, it's more than just a hairstyle. It's a statement that refuses to die. Designers periodically reference her look, actresses adopt variations of the cut, and its association with chic, androgynous modernity remains potent. She proved that a haircut could be a radical act. Perhaps most compellingly, Louise Brooks endures as a powerful symbol of artistic integrity and rebellion against conformity. Her willingness to defy the mighty Hollywood studio system, to prioritize challenging European projects over safe American stardom, even at great personal cost, has made her an inspiration for artists who struggle against commercial pressures. She represents the uncompromising spirit, the artist who refused to sell her soul, even if the price was obscurity for many years. She wasn't just an actress playing roles, she became an idea. The idea that you could be brilliant, beautiful, intelligent, and utterly refuse to compromise, even when the system punished you severely for it. She made being difficult, in the sense of sticking to your guns, look incredibly chic and historically significant, though maybe not advisable for immediate career advancement. Her uncompromising search for freedom truly defined both her life and her career, weaving through her Kansas childhood, her dance aspirations, her Hollywood battles, her European triumphs, her personal relationships, and her final act as a writer. And Pandora's Box isn't just a great, influential film. It stands as a powerful testament to what can happen when unique, uncompromising talent meets genuine artistic courage. It's the lightning strike captured on film, The moment when Louise Brooks, the artist, found her perfect, albeit dangerous, expression. Her influence isn't just historical, it's an active inspiration. As actress Isabella Rossellini once noted, Brooks possessed a modernity that is striking. That modernity, that timeless cool, ensures her legacy continues to fascinate and inspire. Louise Brooks passed away from a heart attack in Rochester, New York, on August 8, 1985, at the age of 78. But her star, extinguished in Hollywood decades earlier only to be rekindled by European cinephiles, and her own sharp prose hasn't faded since her death. If anything, it seems to shine even brighter in the halls of film history and cultural memory. Critical acclaim and scholarly interest in her work have only grown. Film festivals regularly hold retrospectives of her films, particularly the Pabst collaborations. Academics continue to analyze her performances, her unique contribution to acting technique, and her significance as a cultural icon who bridged the silent and sound eras in her own tumultuous way. She's no longer a forgotten starlet. She's recognized as a key figure in 20th century cinema. A huge part of her enduring legacy rests on her brilliant collection of essays, published in 1982 as Lulu in Hollywood. This book remains absolutely essential reading for anyone interested in silent film, the realities of the studio system, or just fiercely intelligent, incisive writing. It's witty, sometimes bitter, often hilarious, always brutally honest, and provides an unparalleled insider's look at the Hollywood machine from someone who saw its inner workings, escaped its clutches, and lived to write about it with devastating clarity. As Kenneth Tynan, the famed critic who championed her writing, declared, Lulu in Hollywood revealed her as possessed of a literary style that is unique in the annals of screen memoirs. It is sharp, laconic, resonant, and surpassingly witty. It cemented her reputation not just as an actress, but as a formidable writer and critic. The book ensures her voice, sharp, analytical, and deeply personal, continues to be heard. So, how is Louise Brooks ultimately remembered? It's not just for the silent films, though they are crucial. It's not just for the iconic haircut, though it's unforgettable. She's remembered as a fiercely intelligent, complex woman who navigated the treacherous waters of fame and obscurity on her own terms. She's remembered for her pioneering naturalism on screen, for embodying the spirit of an age while simultaneously transcending it with her unique depth. She's remembered for her courage, the courage to defy expectations, to walk away, and later, the courage to confront her own past and the industry that discarded her, transforming her experiences into lasting literature. She ultimately found her own voice powerfully, first through the subtle eloquence of her silent performances, and then, perhaps even more enduringly, through the sharp, uncompromising clarity of her writing. She played the Hollywood game by her own rules, lost a few rounds spectacularly, but ultimately, she wrote the most interesting, insightful, and enduring rule book about her own life and times. Want to see the magic, the mystery, the sheer magnetism for yourself? You absolutely have to watch Pandora's Box. Seriously, track it down. We'll drop some links below in the description on where you might be able to find it streaming or on physical media. Prepare to be mesmerized, maybe a little disturbed, but definitely unforgettable. Now, we want to hear from you. What part of Louise Brooks's incredible story fascinates you the most? Do you see her as a self-destructive rebel who sabotaged her own career, or as a principled artist fighting for her freedom? Was Hollywood wrong, or was she impossible? Let us know your thoughts, your theories, your favorite Brooks film down in the comments section. Love this deep dive into a true Hollywood legend? Want more stories like this? Please consider supporting Hollywood Unveiled over on Patreon. Your support, big or small, helps us keep digging into the archives and uncovering these incredible, often forgotten, stories from cinema history. There's a link right below, and of course, if you enjoyed unveiling Louise Brooks with us, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And most importantly, subscribe and ring that notification bell so you don't miss our next episode, where we'll pull back the curtain on another complex and captivating Hollywood icon. Thanks for watching.